Step aside. People like you shouldn't even be here." The woman's voice cut through the low hum of conversation, sharp enough to turn a few heads, but not sharp enough for anyone to intervene. And Elena Whitmore paused mid-step, her fingers tightening slightly around the thin fabric of her sleeve as the words settled over her like something familiar, something expected, because this was how nights like this always began, with a glance, a whisper, a reminder that she existed only on the edges of rooms meant for others. The great hall stretched wide before her, easily 100 feet from one end to the other, lit by iron chandeliers that cast warm gold across polished stone floors, the air thick with perfume and power, laughter echoing beneath vaulted ceilings where banners of old victories hung like silent witnesses, and everywhere she looked there were people who belonged, silk dresses brushing marble, tailored suits moving with quiet confidence, voices rising and falling in practiced ease, while Elena stood just inside the threshold, unnoticed until she was inconvenient, visible only when someone needed to feel taller. She lowered her gaze, not out of submission but out of habit, stepping carefully along the edge of the room where shadows softened her presence, her shoes making almost no sound against the stone, and still it wasn't enough, because a passing guest clipped her shoulder without slowing. The impact slight but deliberate, and the apology never came, never even hovered in the air, as if she were no more solid than the flicker of torchlight on the wall. A faint murmur followed her, voices folding over one another in quiet judgment. "Omega," someone whispered, not bothering to hide it. Another voice softer but crueler, "I heard she doesn't even have a proper bond." And Elena felt the words brush against her skin, not cutting, not anymore, just settling there like dust she had learned long ago not to wipe away in public. She reached the side table near one of the stone pillars, the surface lined with crystal glasses and silver trays, and for a moment she allowed herself to breathe, slow and steady, grounding herself in the small details, the cool air against her wrists, the faint scent of pine drifting in from the open archways, the distant crackle of firewood somewhere beyond the hall. Because if she focused on those things, she could ignore the way the room seemed to press inward, the way every glance that did land on her carried the same quiet dismissal. A laugh broke out nearby, louder this time, and she didn't need to look to know it was at her expense. She could feel it in the shift of energy, in the way conversations angled just enough to include her as the subject but never as a participant. And still she remained where she was, shoulders straight, chin neither lifted nor bowed, existing in that narrow space between being seen and being erased. Someone reached past her for a glass, their arm brushing hers again, careless this time rather than intentional, but the result was the same, a ripple of imbalance, the faintest tremor in her stance, and a drop of deep red wine slipped from the rim of a tilted glass, landing against the pale fabric of her dress, spreading slowly like a blooming stain, and for a heartbeat the world seemed to pause, not out of concern but anticipation, because moments like this were entertainment, small accidents that revealed exactly how little someone mattered. Elena looked down at the stain, watched it darken the cloth, and her fingers curled slightly at her side, not reaching to fix it, not rushing to hide it, just holding there as the silence stretched thin before the inevitable reaction. And when it came, it was exactly what she expected, a soft chuckle, a murmured comment about carelessness, as if she had been the one to spill it, as if gravity itself obeyed the hierarchy of the room. She lifted her head then, just enough to meet no one's eyes in particular, her expression calm, almost distant, and beneath that calm something quieter held steady, something that refused to break no matter how often it was tested. Because even here, even now, standing in a room where she was treated like nothing, Elena Whitmore did not disappear, not completely, not yet. The stain did not spread any further, but it did not need to, because it had already done its work, drawing just enough attention to turn Elena into a quiet spectacle, and she could feel it in the way the air shifted around her, in the subtle pause of nearby conversations, in the way a few people angled their bodies just slightly to get a better look without appearing obvious. And still no one stepped forward, no one offered a cloth or even a word, because helping her would mean acknowledging her, and acknowledging her would disrupt the unspoken order everyone here understood. She reached for a glass of water from the table, her movement slow and deliberate, as if nothing had happened, as if she had complete control over the moment. And the cool surface of the glass steadied her hand just enough to keep it from betraying the tension coiled beneath her calm. And for a second, she considered leaving, slipping back through the tall archway and into the quieter corridors beyond, where the noise of the hall would fade into something distant and manageable. But her feet did not move, because leaving would feel too much like retreat, and she had spent too many years retreating from rooms like this. A voice rose behind her, light and amused, asking loudly enough for others to hear if someone should fetch a servant to clean that up. And the implication hung in the air, not directed at her directly, but circling close enough to make its meaning clear. And a few people laughed, soft and polite, the kind of laughter that never risked offending the wrong person. And Elena exhaled slowly, letting the sound pass through her. Without reaction, her gaze fixed on the surface of the water in her glass as if it were the most interesting thing in the room. To her left, near one of the long banquet tables, a young attendant struggled with a heavy tray, his hands trembling under the weight as he tried to navigate through the crowd without drawing attention. And Elena noticed the slight hitch in his breathing, the way his shoulder dipped unevenly, a sign of strain that most people would ignore. And for a moment she hesitated, because stepping in would mean stepping further into visibility, and visibility here came with a cost. But the hesitation lasted only a heartbeat before she set her glass down and moved toward him. She reached the attendant just as the tray tilted dangerously, and without thinking she steadied it with one hand, her other hand brushing lightly against his wrist, grounding him. And the contact was brief, almost imperceptible, but enough to shift something, enough to ease the tension in his grip so that the tray leveled again, and he looked at her with surprise, his eyes wide, as if he had not expected anyone to notice, let alone help. And Elena offered a small nod, nothing more, before adjusting the tray into a more balanced position and stepping back. For a moment, the space around them grew quiet, not completely silent but altered, as if the room itself had registered the interruption. And then the whispers began again, sharper this time, edged with something less like amusement and more like disdain, because what she had done, simple as it was, did not fit the role assigned to her. And one voice in particular cut through the murmur, asking why an Omega thought she had the right to interfere. And another voice followed, lower but more pointed, suggesting that perhaps she was trying to draw attention to herself. Elena felt the weight of those words settle over her, heavier than before, because now she had chosen to step forward rather than remain unseen, and the consequence of that choice was immediate, visible in the way a few heads turned fully toward her, no longer pretending not to look. And yet she did not step back, did not apologize, did not shrink into the shadows as expected. Instead, she remained where she was, her posture steady, her expression unchanged, even as the room seemed to tighten around her. The attendant moved away quickly, eager to escape the attention, leaving Elena alone in the center of a space that had suddenly become too open, too exposed, and she could feel the shift building, the moment stretching towards something sharper, something that would not pass as easily as a spilled drink or a quiet act of kindness. And though her pulse quickened, though every instinct told her that what came next would not be gentle, she held her ground, because somewhere beneath the weight of every whispered judgment and every dismissive glance, there was a line she would not cross, a line she would not let them push her beyond. And for the first time that night, the room was no longer simply ignoring her, it was watching. The shift in attention did not fade this time. It sharpened, narrowing in on Elena like a lens focusing until there was no space left to hide. And she felt it in the way conversations quieted just enough to listen, in the way footsteps slowed around her, not stopping but circling, as if the entire hall had decided, without a word spoken aloud, that she had become something worth watching. And that alone was enough to make her presence a problem. She kept her shoulders relaxed, her breathing, even though her pulse tapped steadily beneath her ribs, a quiet reminder that standing still here required more strength than leaving ever would. And she could sense the tension building like pressure before a storm, subtle but unmistakable, carried in the way a group of well-dressed guests shifted closer, their expressions polite on the surface but edged with curiosity and something colder beneath. One of them stepped forward, a tall man with a measured smile that never reached his eyes, the kind of smile practiced in rooms like this. And he looked at Elena as if assessing something out of place, something that needed correction, his gaze flicking briefly to the faint stain on her dress before returning to her face. And when he spoke, his tone was smooth, almost conversational, but loud enough to carry, asking if she had mistaken the purpose of the evening, because this was not a place for interference, not a place for those who did not understand their position. A soft murmur followed his words, agreement without commitment. The crowd careful not to take sides too openly, but eager enough to witness what came next. And Elena met his gaze without lifting her chin, without lowering it either, holding that narrow line she had chosen. And for a moment neither of them moved, the space between them tightening, the silence stretching just long enough to become uncomfortable. She could feel the expectation pressing in, the unspoken demand that she apologize, that she retreat, that she restore the balance by making herself smaller again. And for a fraction of a second she considered it, not because she believed she was wrong, but because it would be easier, because it always had been easier to step back and let the moment pass. But something held her in place, something quiet and unyielding that refused to bend this time. The man's smile shifted, thinning slightly as the pause continued, and he took a half step closer, close enough that his presence filled her space, not touching but crowding, and he tilted his head as if waiting for her to correct herself, to say the words he expected. And when she did not, when she simply stood there with that same calm expression, the atmosphere changed again, the polite veneer beginning to crack just enough for irritation to show through. Another voice joined in, lighter but sharper, asking if perhaps she had forgotten how things worked here. And a few people laughed again, quieter now, more cautious, because the tension had shifted from amusement to something less predictable. And Elena felt every second of it, every glance, every whisper, but she did not look away, did not let her gaze drop to the floor as it had so many times before. Instead, she drew a slow breath, steadying herself, and when she spoke, her voice was not loud, not forceful, but it carried clearly in the space that had fallen silent around her, a single word, simple and unadorned, enough to break the rhythm they had tried to impose on her. And in that moment the room seemed to hold its breath, not because of what she said, but because she had said anything at all, because she had chosen not to disappear. The man's expression stilled, the faintest flicker of surprise crossing his features before it was replaced by something more guarded, and he straightened slightly, as if reassessing the situation, as if recalculating the balance that had shifted in a way he had not anticipated. And around them the crowd adjusted, subtle movements, exchanged glances, the collective awareness that the moment had changed, that whatever came next would not follow the script they had expected. Elena felt it too, that shift, fragile but real, and though the weight of the room had not lifted, though the scrutiny remained, something else had entered the space between them, something quieter but stronger than the whispers that had tried to define her, and she held on to it, not knowing yet what it would become, only knowing that she had not stepped back. Not this time. And somewhere beyond the circle of watching eyes, unseen by most, a presence in the shadows stilled, attention fixed entirely on her, as if this moment had been waiting to be witnessed. The single word she had spoken did not echo, yet it lingered, suspended in the charged air as if the room itself did not know where to place it. And that uncertainty was more disruptive than any raised voice could have been, because it did not fit within the boundaries they had drawn for her. It did not resolve into submission or apology, and for a moment no one moved, no one laughed. No one filled the silence with the easy dismissal they had relied on before. The man in front of her studied her more closely now, his expression no longer casual, his gaze sharpening as though he were trying to understand something that should have been simple but was not, and the slight tilt of his head straightened, replaced by a stillness that hinted at calculation, as if he were deciding how to restore control over a situation that had slipped, even if only slightly, beyond his expectations. Around them, the crowd shifted again, not retreating but adjusting, creating a wider circle without seeming to do so, the space opening just enough to isolate Elena at its center, and she felt the change immediately, the way attention no longer brushed past her but settled fully, deliberately, as if she had crossed an invisible threshold, and there was no returning to the edges now. A woman's voice, smooth and carefully amused, broke through the silence, remarking that it was surprising to hear confidence from someone who had no standing to support it, and the comment drew a few soft murmurs of agreement, though the laughter that followed was thinner, less certain than before, as if the room itself was waiting to see whether this would resolve neatly or fracture further. Elena remained still, her hands relaxed at her sides, though her fingers pressed lightly against the fabric of her dress, grounding herself in the familiar sensation, and she let her gaze move across the faces surrounding her, not challenging, not yielding, simply seeing them, really seeing them for the first time that evening. And what she noticed was not just their judgment, but their curiosity, the way some of them watched her as if she were no longer entirely predictable. The man took another step closer, closing the space between them to less than a foot, his presence deliberate now, no longer subtle, and though he did not touch her, the proximity was enough to assert pressure, to remind her of the hierarchy he believed still governed the moment. And he spoke again, quieter this time, but no less firm, suggesting that it would be wise for her to correct herself before she created discomfort for everyone present, and the phrasing was polite, almost considerate. But the expectation beneath it was unmistakable. Elena felt the weight of that expectation press against her, felt the familiar pull to comply, to smooth the situation over, to become smaller so that the room could return to its comfortable balance. But that quiet, unyielding part of her held firm, and instead of stepping back, instead of lowering her gaze, she lifted it just slightly, enough to meet his eyes fully for the first time, and the shift was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it altered the space between them in a way that could not be ignored. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across his expression, not anger, not quite, but something closer to surprise, as if he had not expected resistance in this form, not expected it to be so calm, so controlled, and he straightened instinctively, his posture adjusting in response to something he could not quite name. The murmurs around them softened, then faded again, the crowd sensing that the moment had reached a point where any interruption would feel out of place, and Elena could hear her own breathing, steady and even, could feel the cool air against her skin, the faint warmth of the torches above, grounding her in the present as everything else seemed to narrow to the space directly in front of her. And somewhere beyond that circle, beyond the polished stone and flickering light, the presence that had been watching did not remain still any longer, a subtle shift in the shadows near the far entrance, unnoticed by most, but enough to change the atmosphere in a way that was almost imperceptible at first, like the first drop in temperature before a storm. And though Elena could not see it, could not identify it, she felt something then, a quiet awareness brushing against her senses, not intrusive, not overwhelming, but unmistakably different from the scrutiny surrounding her. And for the first time that night, the weight pressing down on her did not feel absolute, as if something beyond the room, beyond the expectations that had defined her place within it, had begun to move, drawn not by the whispers or the laughter, but by the simple fact that she had chosen, finally, not to disappear. The air did not move the same way anymore. It thickened, not with sound but with awareness, as if something unseen had begun to press gently against the edges of the room. And Elena felt it before she understood it, a subtle shift that made the steady rhythm of her breath falter for just a fraction of a second before she caught it again, grounding herself as she had been taught, because whatever was changing around her, she could not afford to lose control now. The man in front of her seemed to notice it too, though he would never admit it, his shoulders tightening almost imperceptibly, his gaze flicking past her for the briefest moment before returning, sharper now, more intent, as if he were trying to reassert dominance over a situation that had begun to slip through his fingers. And he spoke again, this time with less polish, the smooth edges of his tone wearing thin as he reminded her, more directly now, that silence would serve her better than defiance, that knowing her place would protect her from consequences she did not understand. A few heads nodded in agreement, the crowd eager to see the balance restored, eager for her to fold back into the role they had assigned her, because anything else required them to question the order they depended on. And Elena felt the weight of that expectation settle heavily against her chest, felt the familiar pull to yield, to let the moment pass. But that quiet line within her held, stronger now than it had been before, and instead of retreating, she let the silence stretch again, let his words fall without response, not out of weakness, but out of refusal. A faint sound echoed from the far end of the hall then, not loud, not dramatic, just the soft, deliberate click of a door closing somewhere beyond the main entrance, yet it cut through the tension with unexpected clarity, drawing a few glances away from Elena, just enough to fracture the focus that had been so tightly fixed on her, and the man's eyes shifted again, this time longer, as if whatever had entered the space carried a weight he could not ignore. Elena did not turn, not yet, but she felt it, the change deepening, the subtle drop in temperature. The way the air seemed to settle differently against her skin, and beneath it all, something else, something steady and controlled that did not belong to the restless energy of the crowd, something that moved with intention rather than reaction. The whispers began again, quieter now, threaded with uncertainty, names half-formed and quickly swallowed, as if people were not yet ready to say them aloud. And the circle around Elena loosened just slightly, not breaking, but no longer closing in, as if the room itself had begun to shift its attention, to divide it between what had already happened and what might be arriving. The man hesitated, just for a moment, and that hesitation was enough for Elena to see the crack in his composure, enough for her to understand that whatever had changed was not something he could control. And when he looked back at her, there was a new edge in his expression, not just irritation now, but caution, as if he were no longer entirely certain of the ground beneath his feet. Elena's fingers relaxed at her sides, the tension easing just slightly as she held her position, not advancing, not retreating, simply remaining where she was as the balance of the room shifted around her. And for the first time since she had stepped into the hall, she did not feel like the smallest presence there, did not feel like something easily dismissed, because the attention that had once been dismissive had turned uncertain, and uncertainty, she realized, was its own kind of power. Another sound followed, softer than the first but closer now, measured footsteps against stone, unhurried, each one carrying a quiet authority that did not need to announce itself, and the effect was immediate, subtle but undeniable, conversations faltering, bodies angling instinctively toward the source without conscious thought, as if something deeper than etiquette was guiding their reactions. And Elena felt it more strongly now, that steady presence drawing nearer, not overwhelming, not forceful, but impossible to ignore. She did not turn immediately, though every instinct urged her to, because something told her that this moment mattered, that the choice of when to move, when to acknowledge what was approaching, would shape what came next. And so she remained still for one breath, then another, letting the sound of those footsteps settle into the rhythm of the room, letting the tension build to its quiet peak. And only then did she begin to shift her gaze, just slightly, just enough to acknowledge that whatever had entered the hall had changed everything, even if no one had spoken its name yet. Elena turned just enough to see without fully turning away from the man in front of her, and that single, controlled movement seemed to echo through the space around her, because the moment her attention shifted, so did everyone else's, as if the entire room had been waiting for permission to look, and now they had it. The far end of the hall had opened into a quiet corridor of space, not because anyone had been told to move, but because they had, instinctively, stepping aside without realizing. They were doing it, creating a path that stretched nearly 30 feet from the entrance to the center of the room, and at the end of that path stood a figure who did not hurry, who did not need to, because every step he took carried a kind of certainty that made time itself seem to slow around him. Elena felt it before she fully saw him, the presence that had been building now unmistakable, steady and controlled, like a current beneath the surface of still water, and it moved through the room with quiet authority, not loud, not forceful, but absolute, pressing gently against every other presence until they adjusted around it without question. Conversation stopped, not abruptly but in fragments, words trailing off mid-sentence, laughter fading into silence, and the man in front of her shifted again, this time not forward but back, just a fraction of an inch, so small it might have gone unnoticed if not for the tension that made every movement feel significant. Elena's gaze lifted fully now, drawn to the figure approaching, and the first thing she noticed was not his face, not yet, but the way the space responded to him. The way people who had moments ago been so certain of themselves now stood a little straighter, a little quieter, their attention fixed without daring to be obvious. And beneath that, something deeper, something instinctive, that made the air feel heavier, as if it carried a weight that demanded acknowledgment. He moved with measured steps, each one even, unhurried, covering the distance with a calm that did not need to prove anything. And as he came closer, details sharpened into focus, the dark lines of his clothing, the stillness in his posture, the way his gaze seemed to take in everything without appearing to linger on any one thing. And yet there was a precision to it, an awareness that missed nothing. Elena felt her breath catch, just once, before she steadied it again, because there was something in that presence that reached past the surface, something that did not simply observe but understood. And though she had never stood this close to him before, she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her chest, exactly who he was. The murmurs that had begun at the edges of the room faded completely now, replaced by a silence that was not empty but charged, every person present aware, in their own way, that the balance had shifted beyond their control, and the man who had been standing in front of Elena no longer spoke, no longer pressed forward, his earlier confidence held in place, but no longer expanding, as if he had reached the limit of what he could command in this moment. The figure drew closer, closing the distance until he stood just beyond the circle that had formed around Elena, and for a brief second, he did not step into it, did not interrupt, simply paused, his presence alone enough to alter the shape of the space. And in that pause, Elena felt something unexpected, not fear, not exactly, but awareness, a heightened clarity that sharpened every detail around her, from the faint flicker of torchlight to the quiet shift of fabric as people adjusted their stance. Then he moved again, one final step forward, crossing into the space that had been defined by tension and expectation, and as he did, the circle widened without resistance, opening to accommodate him as if it had always been meant to, and his gaze, which had taken in the room as a whole, settled at last, not on the man who had challenged her, not on the crowd that had watched, but on Elena herself. And in that instant, everything else seemed to fall away, the whispers, the judgment, the weight of the room, leaving only that single point of connection, steady and undeniable, as if the moment that had begun with quiet dismissal had been leading, inevitably, to this. The moment his gaze settled on her, the world did not stop, but it narrowed, compressing everything else into something distant and secondary. And Elena felt it in the way her breath slowed without her asking it to, in the way the noise of the hall faded into a low, indistinct hum, as if the space between them had drawn all attention inward and left the rest to blur at the edges. His eyes did not flicker, did not pass over her as others had done. They remained, steady and deliberate, as though he were seeing her not as a figure within the room, but as the center of the moment itself. And there was nothing rushed in that attention, nothing careless. It carried weight, intent, and something quieter beneath it that she could not yet name. Elena did not step back, though every instinct she had been taught might have urged her to, because there was no dismissal in that gaze, no quiet judgment waiting to push her aside. And for the first time since entering the hall, she felt something shift inside her, something that did not shrink in response but held, steady and unbroken. Around them, the silence deepened, not empty but expectant, and the man who had stood before her seemed to recognize it too, his posture adjusting once more, this time not in assertion but in restraint, as if he were suddenly aware that whatever authority he believed he held had been eclipsed by something far greater. And though he did not speak, the tension in his shoulders gave him away, a subtle stiffness that had not been there before. The figure moved one step closer, closing the final distance between himself and Elena, and even that small movement carried a ripple through the room, drawing every eye without effort, because presence like his did not require announcement. It commanded attention simply by existing. Elena became aware of the details now, the quiet precision in the way he carried himself, the stillness that suggested control rather than restraint, the sense that nothing about him was accidental. And yet, for all that weight, there was no urgency in him, no need to rush or prove. as if time itself adjusted to his pace rather than the other way around. He did not immediately address the man who had challenged her, did not acknowledge the crowd that had watched. Instead, he remained where he was, his attention still fixed on Elena, and in that deliberate choice, the imbalance of the moment became unmistakable. Because what had once been a spectacle centered on her weakness had shifted into something else entirely, something defined by his focus. Elena felt the heat rise faintly beneath her skin, not from embarrassment, but from awareness, the realization that she was being seen in a way she had not been before, not overlooked, not judged, but recognized. And though she did not fully understand what that meant yet, she could not deny the steadiness it brought to her stance, the way her shoulders eased, just slightly, the way her breathing settled into something more certain. A whisper moved through the edges of the room, soft but unmistakable, a name carried from one voice to another before fading again. And with it came a subtle shift in posture from those watching, a collective awareness of rank and presence that no longer needed to be spoken aloud. The man beside her finally stepped back, a full step this time, not dramatic but undeniable, creating space where he had once tried to close it. And though he said nothing, the movement itself spoke clearly enough, a silent acknowledgment that whatever this moment had become, it no longer belonged to him. Elena remained where she was, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, but inside, something had shifted, something that had been quiet and hidden now beginning to take shape, not as defiance, not as rebellion, but as a simple, undeniable truth that she could no longer ignore. And as she stood there, facing the man whose presence had altered the entire room without a single word, she realized that this moment, this fragile, suspended point in time, was not the end of something, but the beginning of something she had never been allowed to imagine before. No one spoke, not because they had nothing to say, but because no one dared to be the first to break what had settled over the room. And Elena felt that silence as something alive, something stretching tight between every person present, waiting, anticipating, and at the center of it all, his gaze had not moved from her. There was no rush in him, no impatience, as if he allowed the moment to unfold exactly as it should. And that patience carried more authority than any command ever could, because it made everyone else aware of their own reactions, their own hesitation, their own place in the hierarchy that had just been rewritten without a single word. Elena held his gaze, not challenging, not retreating, simply present, and though her heart beat steadily against her ribs, there was no panic in it, only awareness, sharp and clear, as if something inside her had aligned with the quiet certainty he carried. And for a brief second, the noise of the hall, the judgment, the whispers, all of it felt distant, secondary to the simple fact that he saw her. The man who had confronted her earlier shifted again, a subtle movement of his weight from one foot to the other, but it was enough to break the stillness just slightly. And when he finally spoke, his voice had changed, no longer smooth, no longer entirely controlled, as if he were navigating unfamiliar ground, acknowledging the presence that had entered without directly addressing it, attempting to reclaim something of the authority he had lost. But the effort did not land the same way it had before, the words sounding thinner, less certain, as though even he could hear the difference. The figure beside Elena did not respond immediately, did not even turn his attention toward the speaker, and that absence of reaction carried its own weight, a silent dismissal that rippled outward, causing a few more heads to lower slightly, a few shoulders to tighten as the reality of the moment settled more firmly into place. Elena noticed it all, the way the room adjusted around him, the way people who had stood tall moments ago now seemed more measured, more cautious, and for the first time she understood something she had only ever sensed from a distance, that power was not always loud, not always declared. Sometimes it simply existed, undeniable, reshaping everything around it without needing permission. Then, finally, he moved, not away from her, not toward the man who had spoken, but closer, just enough that the distance between them narrowed to something almost intimate in its precision, though there was nothing improper in it, nothing that crossed a boundary, only a deliberate closing of space that shifted the focus entirely. And when he spoke, his voice was low, steady, and unmistakably clear, carrying through the silence without needing to rise, each word measured, controlled, and absolute in a way that left no room for interpretation. He did not address the room, did not acknowledge the crowd. He spoke to her, and only her, as if everything else was irrelevant, as if the moment belonged solely to the two of them. And the effect was immediate, the tension in the room breaking. Not into chaos, but into something more structured, more defined, as though a line had been drawn that no one dared to cross. Elena felt the shift like a physical change in the air, the pressure that had once been directed at her now dispersing, redirected. And though she did not move, did not react outwardly, something inside her steadied even further, anchoring her in place as the weight that had threatened to overwhelm her began, slowly, to lift. A quiet murmur spread at the edges of the room again, not mocking this time, not dismissive, but uncertain, cautious, and threaded with recognition, and though no one spoke the words aloud, the understanding was there, shared in glances and lowered gazes, that the balance of the room had changed, that whatever had been happening before no longer held, and Elena, standing at the center of it, was no longer something easily overlooked, because the one person who could define that truth had already made his position clear without ever needing to raise his voice. The sound of his voice did not fade when he finished speaking. It lingered in the air like a quiet command that did not need repetition, and Elena felt it settle around her, not pressing, not overwhelming, but anchoring, as if the space itself had shifted to accommodate a new center of gravity, one that no longer pushed her outward but held her exactly where she stood. She did not look away from him, not because she could not, but because something in that moment made it feel unnecessary, as if breaking that connection would mean losing the clarity that had finally cut through the noise of the room. And for the first time since she had entered the hall, she was not measuring herself against the expectations surrounding her, not adjusting, not shrinking, simply existing within the space he had created without effort. Around them, the crowd responded in subtle but unmistakable ways, shoulders lowering, gazes dropping, conversations dissolving into silence not out of confusion but out of recognition. And Elena could sense it, the collective understanding that something had been decided, even if no one had spoken it aloud, that whatever place she had occupied before no longer applied in the same way. The man who had confronted her stood very still now, his earlier confidence replaced by something more restrained, his posture careful, his expression composed but no longer certain. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter, measured in a different way, as if each word had to pass through a filter of caution before it could be released, and even then, it carried none of the authority it had before, only the faint echo of it. Elena did not respond to him, did not need to, because the moment no longer required her defense, no longer demanded that she justify her presence. And that realization settled into her with a quiet strength, not sudden, not overwhelming, but steady, like something that had always been there and was only now being allowed to surface. The figure beside her shifted slightly, not away, not breaking the space between them, but adjusting just enough to acknowledge the rest of the room. And when his gaze finally moved from her, it did not scatter, did not wander, it landed with purpose, first on the man who had spoken, then briefly across the faces that had watched. And though he said nothing further, the effect was immediate, a ripple of awareness passing through the crowd, a silent understanding that the boundaries of the moment had been redrawn. Elena followed that shift with her own awareness, noticing the way people who had once dismissed her now avoided meeting her eyes, the way their attention moved carefully, as if they were recalibrating their place in relation to hers, and it felt unreal for a second, not because it was impossible, but because it was so sudden, so different from everything she had known before. She glanced down briefly at the faint stain on her dress, the mark that had drawn their attention earlier, and for a moment she saw it differently, not as something that diminished her, but as something that no longer mattered, because the room had already moved past it, had been forced to, and when she lifted her gaze again, there was no trace of the earlier hesitation in her posture, only a quiet steadiness that held firm. The murmurs at the edges of the hall began to return, but they were not the same, not sharp, not dismissive. They carried a different tone now, softer, uncertain, threaded with something that resembled respect or perhaps caution, and Elena felt it without fully turning toward it, aware of how the energy had shifted without needing to confirm it directly. Beside her, his presence remained constant, unchanged, not pressing for acknowledgment, not demanding anything from her, simply there. And in that steadiness, Elena found something unexpected, a sense of balance that had been missing before, not because she depended on it, but because it revealed something she had not been allowed to see, that her place in the world had never been as small as they had made it seem. The moment stretched again, but this time it did not feel fragile, did not feel like something that might collapse under the weight of a single word or glance. It felt grounded, defined, and as Elena stood there, aware of every shift around her, she understood that whatever came next would not return her to where she had been, because the room had already changed, and so had she. The shift that had begun quietly now settled into something undeniable, something that no one in the room could pretend not to feel, and Elena stood at its center with a stillness that no longer came from endurance but from certainty, because whatever had changed was no longer fragile. It had taken root, and the way people moved around her made that clear without a single word needing to be spoken. The man who had once stood too close to her now kept his distance, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention, but enough that the difference was unmistakable, his posture careful, his gaze no longer fixed on her, but moving elsewhere, as if he understood that continuing to press forward would no longer produce the result he expected. Elena noticed it all, the recalibration, the subtle adjustments, the way the room reorganized itself around a new center of gravity, and she felt it not as something imposed on her, but as something she had stepped into, something that had always been there, waiting beneath the surface of every moment she had been told to shrink. Beside her, his presence remained steady, unchanged, and when he moved again, it was not to dominate the space, not to command attention, but to define it, a slight shift of his stance, a measured turn of his shoulders. That placed him fully within the moment rather than at its edge, and the effect was immediate, the room aligning itself around that movement without hesitation. Elena felt the subtle proximity of him now, close enough that she could sense the quiet strength in the way he held himself, the controlled stillness that suggested power held in reserve rather than displayed, and though he had not touched her, had not crossed that boundary, there was a sense of presence that extended beyond physical distance, something that anchored her without limiting her, something that allowed her to remain exactly where she was without question. A voice from the far side of the hall attempted to resume conversation, light and forced, as if to restore the earlier atmosphere, but it faltered quickly, unable to carry, because the weight of the moment had not lifted, it had simply shifted into something more structured, more defined, and no one seemed willing to disrupt it now. Elena drew a slow breath, aware of the way her body had adjusted, the tension that had once tightened her shoulders now gone, replaced by a calm that felt unfamiliar but not unwelcome. And when she lifted her gaze again, she did not look for approval, did not search for reactions. She simply observed, taking in the faces around her, the lowered eyes, the careful expressions, the subtle distance people now kept, and in that observation, she understood something clearly, that the room had not changed because she had asked. It had changed because someone else had decided it would. He spoke again then, not loudly, not for the room, but the words carried nonetheless, clear and precise, and though they were simple, they left no room for interpretation, because they did not question, did not suggest, they established, and as they settled into the space around them, Elena felt the final shift complete, the last thread of doubt dissolving into something steadier, something that did not depend on the reactions of others. The response was immediate, not in sound but in movement, a collective adjustment that rippled outward, heads lowering slightly, bodies aligning in quiet acknowledgment, not forced, not dramatic, but unmistakable, and Elena felt it like a change in the air itself, the weight that had once pressed against her now moving away, redirected, leaving her standing in a space that felt entirely different from the one she had entered. She did not move, did not step forward or back, but there was a subtle change in the way she held herself, a quiet lift in her posture that came not from pride but from recognition, the understanding that she no longer needed to make herself smaller to fit into the room, because the room had already made space for her. Beside her, his presence did not waver, did not demand acknowledgment, and yet it defined everything, and Elena knew, without needing to be told, that this moment, This quiet, irreversible shift was not something that could be undone, not by whispers, not by glances, not by anything that had once held power over her, because whatever had been decided here tonight had already taken hold, and as she stood there, aware of every subtle movement around her, she understood that the life she had known before this moment no longer existed in quite the same way. The room did not return to what it had been. It could not, because something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface, something that no polite conversation or forced laughter could restore, and Elena stood within that change with a quiet awareness that settled deeper with every passing second, not overwhelming, not sudden, but steady, like a truth that had finally been acknowledged after being ignored for far too long. She became aware of the small details again, the faint flicker of candlelight reflecting against polished stone, the soft rustle of fabric as people adjusted their stance, the subtle shift of breath in a room that had collectively chosen restraint over reaction. And within all of it, there was a new distance, not physical, but perceptual, as if the lens through which she had been viewed had been replaced entirely. Beside her, his presence remained unchanged, grounded, deliberate. And when he moved again, it was not to command, not to dominate, but to acknowledge, a slight turn toward her that drew her attention fully, not through force, but through the simple fact that his focus mattered in a way no one else's had before. And Elena felt that shift immediately, the narrowing of her awareness back to the space between them, where everything else seemed to quiet. For a moment, he said nothing, and in that silence, there was no discomfort, no pressure, only a calm that felt intentional, as if he allowed her the space to exist within the moment without interruption, and that, more than anything, unsettled her in a way she did not expect. Because she had spent so long adjusting to others, reacting to their expectations, that being given space without demand felt unfamiliar, almost disorienting. She met his gaze again, not with hesitation, not with defiance, simply with presence, and though her heart moved a little faster beneath her ribs, there was no fear in it, only awareness, a sharp clarity that made everything else fall into place around her. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before, not in volume, but in tone, stripped of the weight he had used to define the room moments ago, and directed entirely at her, each word measured, deliberate, and carrying a different kind of authority, one that did not press outward but drew inward, creating a space that felt separate from the rest of the hall. Elena listened, every part of her attention focused, not because she was compelled to, but because something in the way he spoke made it impossible not to, and as his words settled, she felt a shift within herself, subtle but undeniable, as if something that had been locked away, something she had been taught to ignore, had been acknowledged without being named. Around them, the room remained still, not frozen, but held, every person aware that whatever was happening between them was not meant to be interrupted, and even those who might have once dismissed her now seemed careful, their movements restrained, their voices lowered, as if they understood, instinctively, that the moment no longer belonged to them. Elena became aware of the space she occupied again, not as something borrowed or fragile, but as something defined, something real, and when she drew her next breath, it felt different, deeper, as if the air itself had shifted to meet her where she stood. She did not step forward, did not reach out, but there was a quiet change in her posture, a slight lift of her chin, a steadiness in her shoulders that had not been there before, not because she was trying to appear stronger, but because she no longer needed to appear anything at all. His gaze did not waver as he finished speaking, and for a moment, the silence returned. But it was not the same silence as before. It was no longer filled with judgment or expectation. It was something else entirely, something that held the weight of what had just been acknowledged, and Elena felt it settle around her, not as a burden, but as something she could stand within without fear. Beyond them, the room began to breathe again, slowly, cautiously, as if testing the boundaries of this new reality. But nothing returned to what it had been, nothing reset, because the shift had already taken place, and as Elena stood there, aware of every subtle movement, every quiet adjustment, she understood that whatever came next would not erase what had happened here, would not undo the moment that had redefined her place in the world, because for the first time, she had not been overlooked, not been dismissed, she had been seen, and that was something no one in the room could pretend had not happened. The moment did not fracture or fade. It deepened, settling into something quieter, yet far more powerful than anything that had come before. And Elena stood within it with a stillness that no longer came from restraint but from acceptance. Because she could feel it now, not just in the way the room had changed around her, but in the way she existed within it, no longer at its edges, no longer something to be overlooked, but something defined, something acknowledged. The faint sounds of the hall began to return, not as they had been, not careless or dismissive, but measured, restrained, as if every word spoken now passed through a silent awareness of what had just occurred, and even those who resumed quiet conversation did so with careful glances, their attention no longer drifting past her, but circling back, cautious, deliberate. Elena noticed the shift in those glances, the way they no longer dismissed her presence but accounted for it. And though no one approached, no one spoke directly to her, the distance itself carried meaning, a respect born not from familiarity but from recognition, and that recognition settled over her with a quiet weight that did not press down but lifted something inside her that had been held low for far too long. Beside her, he remained unchanged, his presence steady, unshaken by the movement of the room, and when he turned slightly, his attention still anchored to her. There was no urgency in it, no expectation, only a calm certainty that felt almost disarming in its simplicity. Elena became aware of her own posture again, the way her shoulders rested without tension, the way her breath moved evenly, and for a moment she allowed herself to take in the space fully, not from the edges as she had before, but from the center, seeing the hall not as something she had to navigate carefully, but as something she could simply stand within. The stain on her dress remained, a faint mark against the pale fabric, but it no longer drew attention, no longer defined her place in the room, and when her gaze passed over it briefly, there was no impulse to hide it, no instinct to adjust or cover it, only the quiet understanding that it did not matter anymore. A small movement caught her attention at the edge of her awareness. The same attendant she had helped earlier, now standing at a distance, watching with wide, uncertain eyes, as if unsure whether to approach or retreat, and Elena met his gaze for a brief second, offering the smallest nod, a silent reassurance that did not need words, and the tension in his posture eased just enough before he turned away, returning to his tasks with a steadiness that had not been there before. The room continued to shift around them, not dramatically, not in any way that would draw attention, but in small, cumulative changes, the kind that reshaped the atmosphere without announcing themselves, and Elena felt it in the way space opened naturally around her, in the way people adjusted their paths without needing to be told, in the way the balance of the hall had been redefined without a single formal declaration. Beside her, his presence did not diminish, did not withdraw, and though he had already changed everything with a few measured words, he did not linger in dominance, did not press the moment further, instead allowing it to settle, to take root on its own, and that restraint, that control, carried its own kind of authority, one that did not need reinforcement. Elena turned her gaze back to him fully, not because she felt compelled to, but because something in the quiet between them invited it, and when their eyes met again, there was no tension, no uncertainty, only a calm understanding that passed without words, as if something had been recognized on both sides, something that did not need to be explained to exist. The hall around them continued to breathe, slowly, carefully, but it did not return to what it had been, could not return, because the shift had already taken hold, and as Elena stood there, aware of every subtle change, every quiet acknowledgment, she understood that this moment was not simply an interruption in her life, not a brief deviation that would fade once the night ended. It was something else entirely, something that had altered the path ahead in a way she could not yet fully see, but could feel with a clarity that left no room for doubt. The air in the hall had shifted completely, carrying a weight that was no longer dictated by expectation or judgment, and Elena felt it settle around her as a quiet certainty, a recognition that she had not asked for, but had earned through the stillness, the patience, the subtle refusal to be overlooked, and it wrapped around her like a cloak, grounding her, steadying her. And for the first time that night, She did not feel invisible or secondary. She felt entirely present. The figure beside her remained unchanged, calm and measured, his presence defining the space without asserting it forcefully. And as he glanced around, his eyes briefly acknowledged the room without interruption, as if the subtle tension that had gripped every watcher now belonged solely to him to manage. And even that management did not diminish Elena, it highlighted her, placed her firmly within the center of what was happening, not by volume, not by command, but by quiet alignment. The murmurs that had begun at the edges of the hall earlier had all but vanished, replaced by a cautious awareness, a careful stillness that suggested everyone present understood that the earlier hierarchy had been irreversibly altered, and even those who had tried to challenge her presence earlier now kept their distance, subtle but deliberate, adjusting their steps and gestures as if to accommodate something they did not yet fully comprehend. Elena's gaze swept briefly across the room, taking in the lowered heads, the measured movements, the softened stances, and in each detail, she recognized the proof that her presence was no longer negotiable, no longer something to be dismissed, and she allowed herself a quiet inhale, steady and deliberate. Feeling the tension in her shoulders ease for the first time in hours, the strain of anticipation replaced by the simple clarity that she was here, fully, without compromise. Beside her, his stance remained steady, almost imperceptibly adjusting as he took a small step closer, and though there was no need for words, the subtle shift conveyed a reassurance, a steadying anchor in a space that had been unpredictable moments ago, and the alignment of their presence created a kind of balance in the room that could not be ignored, commanding acknowledgment from every corner without a single gesture of overt authority. Elena felt the faintest rise of warmth in her chest, not from attention but from awareness, the realization that her quiet determination had been witnessed, that the stillness she had maintained had not been for nothing, and as she met his gaze again, she felt the unspoken acknowledgment pass between them, a recognition that did not need explanation to exist, that was simply understood. The distant hum of the hall returned gradually, carrying with it the subtle rhythm of life. Resuming, but the difference was profound, imperceptible to some, but glaringly clear to those who had paid attention. The space she occupied was no longer defined by others' expectations. It was hers to hold, steady, unchallenged, and fully visible. The attendant she had aided earlier moved more confidently now, weaving carefully through the hall, and the small nod exchanged between them carried weight, a quiet recognition that had previously been impossible in this room, and it was mirrored in other small gestures across the space, subtle adjustments that spoke to an acknowledgment long denied. Elena felt the shift deepen as she breathed evenly, sensing the collective understanding of the crowd, sensing the steady certainty of his presence beside her, sensing that the room itself had been reorganized in the most fundamental way, not through spectacle, not through noise, not through force, but through presence, patience, and quiet assertion. And in that realization, she felt a profound clarity, the knowledge that she had not only endured but had been acknowledged fully, and that recognition could not be taken away. The shadows at the edges of the room seemed to recede slightly, the light settling evenly across polished stone and smooth fabric, and in that illumination, the subtle lines of control and calm in his posture mirrored her own, reinforcing the moment without need for any further action. Elena exhaled slowly, not in relief, not in triumph, but in a quiet acceptance, a recognition that the events of the night had culminated in a shift that was irrevocable, that she now existed in a space defined by her presence and aligned with his acknowledgment. And as the hall breathed around them, measured and steady, she knew that this night had rewritten the way she would be seen, the way she would move, the way the balance of power in the room would forever be measured, because for the first time, she had not only been noticed, she had been seen, fully, undeniably, and the room, and everyone in it, could not look away.